Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 89, the Song of the Covenant. Last time we looked at Psalm 88, where we had Haman the Ezrahite. He was the author, at least we see two or four Haman the Ezrahite, and we saw that psalm sort of ended in a dark place where the Lord had been silent in the midst of trouble, and we got to the end of the psalm, and there's no light, it just ends. And we said that's a terrible ending unless there's a part two. And now we come to part two, Psalm 89. This time it's going to be, instead of Haman the Ezraite, it's Ethan the Ezraite. So possibly a brother or family member. We seem to catch that from when we look at the First Chronicles, and he's going to be talking about remembering God's covenant. Um, there's still problems, and there's still silence in the midst of the trouble. But this is going to be more positive in that we'll see God's promises, specifically God's covenant promises to David will be in view. So let's dig in. We start off with the superscription, a maskell of Ethan the Ezrahite, and we would notice previously that 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 31 mentions Ethan the Ezrahite. Speaking of Solomon in context, talks about how Solomon was so wise and he was wiser than all men. And at the top of the list is Ethan the Ezrahite. So we don't know too much about this person except that he was known for his wisdom. We now start the psalm itself. I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. To all generations, I will make known of your faithfulness with my mouth. Now, notice I've circled loving kindness, our old friend Hesed, and then forever and faithfulness, because these themes are going to be repeated. I'm going to sing of God's. Sometimes we translate it mercy. I like the translation loyalty. That's my sort of regular go-to for the term Hesed. But I'm going to sing of that forever. To all generations, I'll make known your faithfulness with my mouth. Notice it's Ethan who's doing the singing. He's the singer. This is his song, and he is addressing. In a sense, he's addressing us, but he's singing about the Lord. Verse 2, for I have said loving kindness, there it is again, will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. So again, all three of those are seen in the first verse, and again in the second verse. We're going to see, we'll be back to a number of those as we go through the psalm. Verse 3, now there's a change in voice. I have made a covenant with my chosen. This is God speaking. And God has made a covenant with my chosen. Notice I've sworn to David. Now, when he talks about made a covenant, karati berit is the word for covenant. Notice how the translation here says, I have made a covenant. That's okay, but if we want to be exactly precise, we would say, I have cut a covenant with my chosen. Because when you entered into a covenant, if you did it according to all the formality, what you would do is you'd take an animal and you would kill the animal. And then once you'd kill the animal, then you'd cut him into two parts and separate the pieces. And the parties that were making the covenant together, or the parties that were cutting the covenant, would pass between the pieces of the animal. And what you were saying is, if I don't keep my word is my bond, but if I don't keep my word, then what happened to that animal ought to happen to me. So you were putting a curse on yourself when you, but that only becomes a curse if you break any of the terms of the covenant. So this idea of cutting a covenant is seen so often in the scriptures that by the time we get to the prophets, instead of describing it as cutting a covenant, we're going to see the prophets actually say, where God will say, I cut with you. And he won't even have to use the word covenant. As soon as he says, I cut, you understand as the reader that we're speaking of a covenant. So here, I've cut a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn. Now, swearing is something that you do as part of a covenant. So, nishbati is the term here, but it's the nifal perfect. Now, nifal is usually the passive stem. Um, but in this case, it almost always appears that way. First person singular. Notice I have sworn, and that phrase shava, to swear, is also the same word for the number seven. So if we wanted to learn our Hebrew numbers, that would be the number seven. Now, there are sometimes words which have two different meanings, even though the word is spelled identically. I think of the word trunk, where it can be the back of a car, or it can be the center part of a tree, or it can be the proboscis, the nose of an elephant. Um, Three different meanings, one basic word, but the meanings are unrelated to each other. That's not the case here. This seems to be related to the term swear and seven. They seem to have related together. As I said, it appears nearly always in the nifel or the hifal. Nifel is the passive stem. Um, Now you don't say I was sworn, but it's the idea. I entered into an oath. I allowed myself to be oathed, as I sworn, if we can take it that way. And so it's to be bound with an oath is the idea here. But we actually have cases in both the Old Testament. I think of the oath that Abraham enters into with the king of Philistia, and it's set around the number seven, where he's dug a number of wells, and there's a seventh well, and they call it Bir Shiva. Shiva is the word for oath. Bir is the word for well, the seventh well, or the well of the oath. And you say, well, which is it? And the answer is yes, it's sort of both. And not only among the Hebrews was this idea there that the number seven was associated with an oath, but also in both Homer's Greek, um, and also I think in Herodotus there's a place where now that's Greek, that's not Hebrew, and yet they carried that same idea of associating the number seven with an oath. Now I'm not sure where that started from. I suspect it might have gone back to the Bible and the seventh day where God rests, but how that's connected, I'm not sure. Anyway, I've sworn to David, my servant, and what we're going to be talking about now is the Davidic covenant, and here is the oath that God has sworn. I will establish your seed forever. Remember, forever is a big deal there. We're going to see that term seed used a few times here in this chapter. Sometimes it will be translated seed, sometimes it will be translated other ways, but it's the same idea. It's speaking of David's descendants, and God had entered into a covenant with David. He had sworn to David that you will have either you or your descendants, your seed, will be sitting upon the throne forever. And of course, ultimately, this is going to refer to David's greater son. Ultimately, it's going to refer to Jesus as the Messiah. But here, verse 4, I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. And then time for a break, Selah. So we had Ethan start off the first two verses, and now we have God speaking. Um, so Ethan sings in verses 1 and 2, and he's singing of God's faithfulness. And then God sings, and he talks about how God says, I cut a covenant with David. But now we're going to go back to Ethan. So let's do that. Verse 5, the heavens will praise your wonders, O Lord. This is Ethan speaking to God. And notice, the heavens are going to do that. Will praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness. Remember how faithfulness is one of the repeated words? Your faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. Now, the assembly of the holy ones sounds like not like something down here, but something in the presence of God. And we're going to see this developed in the next few verses. So, Ethan sings. We had verses 1 and 2. We have God sings, and about how he cut a covenant with David. Now we go back to Ethan, and he's going to be singing. This is actually going to take us from verse 5 all the way to verse 18. And his song will be praise to God from heaven and on earth. And this is going to be a praise section. So the praise begins, for who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? And of course, the answer is obvious. The answer is no one. That God is God and nobody is bigger than the Lord. Notice the name of God that's given here. Who is comparable to the Lord? Who among The sons of the mighty is like the Lord. Now we're not looking at comparing God to people down here, but sons of the mighty, that's up in another plane. So who in the skies, who among the sons of the mighty? Notice this is saying the same thing with different words. This is typical Hebrew parallelism. Verse 7, a God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones. Did you catch that? Sons of the mighty, who's in the skies, the council of the holy ones, and finally, and awesome above all those who are around him. It's picturing God in the heavens, and who's in the heavens besides God? Well, the sons of the mighty and the council of the holy ones, and these spirit beings. Now we think of that as angels, but that term's not going to be used here. Is it something else? I don't think it is. I think angels works, but there's a lot more to angelic life than perhaps we realize. I think maybe that's the point here. But really, the point is that God is greater than all of it. So sometimes, people talk about, sons of God, and what's that talking about in a heavenly sense? The council of the holy ones, the divine council, things like that. That's Yes, those things are mentioned in the Bible, but the big thing is God. Don't miss him. He's what it's all about. O Lord God of hosts, who is like you, O mighty Lord? And notice that the name of God continues to be used here, represented here by the word Lord in all capital letters. That's our translators telling us this is God's name that's being used here. Your faithfulness also surrounds you. You rule in the swelling of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You yourself crush Rahab, like one who is slain. Now, we talked about this in a previous psalm, Rahab, and we noted that this reference to Rahab, I know it sounds like Rakav with like Rahab, but this is Rahab. This is not the same spelling. Um, Job chapter 26 and verse 12 and 13 give a hint of this. I'm going to call it a creature, where it's speaking of God, how he quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered, there it is, Rahab. By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. So what is Rahab? It's some sort of mythological fleeing serpent. Is that a picture of Satan? Um, Maybe it is by the time I get to the book of Revelation. I'm not sure that imagery was being used here. Maybe it was. I could be wrong. But notice it's how God has conquered, has crushed every great power, including this mythological. Now, is that represented by some actual beast in the sea? I don't know. Big, great white shark, or again, that would be speculation. I don't want to go there. But it's used here in Psalm 89 as this great beast. It had been used in some of the Psalms, also in Isaiah, to describe Egypt as the beast. So the imagery could take a number of different forms. I don't think Egypt is in view here. You yourself crush a Rahab like one who is slain. You scattered your with your mighty arm. Notice Isaiah chapter 51, verses 9 and 10. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Again, picturing, are there really dragons? Well, in mythology there was. Was there something they called a dragon that was in the sea? Maybe. I'm not going to go dogmatic on that. But notice the association with the sea. Verse 10, was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep? And he goes on to talk about, what God did over Egypt in the context of Isaiah 51. But that's not our purpose here. It's talking about how God is great, and he has defeated great things, but he's greater than that in the heavens. He's greater than that which is in the sea. And remember that to the Jewish mind, the sea was a very dangerous place. And yet you scattered your enemies, both Rahab and other enemies, both on sea and on land, with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth also is yours. The world and all it contains, you have founded them. This is taking us all the way back to creation. Verse 12, the north and the south, you go any direction you want. If you went east and west, if you go west from Israel, you're in the sea. So we already talked about that. East is out in the desert, but the north and the south, those are significant directions. You have created them. Tabor and Hermon, shout for joy at your name. These are actually mountains that are located in Israel. Tabor is located in the valley of Jezreel. It's at the east end of the valley, and it sort of stands all by itself. It's not really connected to any other mountains around it. And Mount Hermon is way up in the north. You go as far north as you can and still be in Israel, right on the outskirts, and you'll find the snow-capped mountain. It's always snow-capped because it's so high, 10,000 feet above sea level. And notice, these mountains shout for joy at your name. You have a strong arm. Your hand is mighty. Your right hand is exalted. We're going to see that, arm, hand, right hand. That's going to be repeated. Verse 14, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Remember how we said righteousness is one of the repeated words. So was loving kindness. Here it is, loving kindness and truth go before you. How blessed are the people who know the joyful sound. O Lord, they walk in the light of your countenance or of your face. Verse 16, in your name they rejoice all the day long, and by your righteousness they are exalted. So it holds up, exalts, if I can say it that way, the righteousness and loving kindness and truth and justice of God. But notice how righteousness is at the beginning and the end of this section. We get to verse 17, for you are the glory of their strength, and by your favor our horn is exalted. Now, horn was something you found on an animal, but an animal that has a horn, that's its strength. A lion might have its teeth. A lion doesn't need horns, but a horn of a gazelle or a horn of any sort of animal that has horns, that's its weaponry. And notice, by your favor, our horn, our weaponry, our strength is exalted. For our shield belongs to the Lord, and our king. Now, notice you've got the strength, the horn, the shield, but also the king, and our king to the Holy One of Israel. And remember that this was spotlighting God's covenant with David, who was promised to be the king, and he was by the time this promise is made. He was already the king. But it's also spotlighting, sort of remember at the back of your mind, is that it's not only King David, there's a bigger king, a better king, an eventual king that hasn't been revealed yet at the time of the writing of the psalm. And I'm talking, of course, of King Jesus. So we had Ethan singing, and that was verses 1 and 2 of God's faithfulness. We had God singing, I cut a covenant with David. We had Ethan singing now for the last, from verses 5 to 18, praise to God from the heaven and on earth and of all the things that God does. Next, we go to verses 19 through 37, where God is going to sing again, and he's going to reference the covenant promises to David and how those promises are going to be forever. So again, a return to the covenant. Here we have it, verse 19. Once you spoke in vision to your godly ones and said, I have given help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found, now you find out who the one is. I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil, I have anointed him. And that's our old friend Mashiach, the idea of an anointed one. Remember that you would anoint prophets, you would anoint priests, and here you would anoint kings. And David had been anointed at a time when Saul was still king. And yet David was anointed, and that anointing was promissory. It was a promise that eventually he would be king instead of Saul. And notice, with my holy oil, I've anointed him. Verse 21, with whom my hand will be established, my arm also will strengthen him. Notice the hand and the arm. We spotlighted that earlier. God's hand and his arm doing great things. In this case, doing great things for David. Verse 22, the enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. Now, we're not necessarily being told that those bad things are here right now, but we're going to find out before we get to the end of the psalm, they are. Preview of things to come later on in the psalm. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him, but I shall crush his adversaries before him and strike those who hate him. So David, can I say it this way? David's going to win. You say, well, didn't David have some failures? Yes, he did. In fact, wasn't he at times even deceived by the enemy? I'm thinking of that passage in Chronicles that talks about Satan tempted him. Yes, but David's story didn't end there. It didn't end on that defeatist note. Verse 24: My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name his horn, there it is again, will be exalted. So David's strength continues all his days, all the way to the end. And of course, remember, it's not going to end with David. It's going to go from David to David's descendants and David's greater son as well. Verse 25: I shall also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. Now, that's showing how pervasive his authority is. Seas, that's a dangerous place in the Jewish mindset. They were basically landlubbers. They saw themselves as people who had come out of the desert, not out of the sea. And yet, here's one who sets his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers, and he's in control of all sorts of things. Verse 26: He will cry to me, and notice what he says: You are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. Verse 27, I also shall make him my firstborn. Now, firstborn doesn't necessarily mean that he's the first to ever be born. I know that if we just use that term by itself, divorced of any other context, that is the natural meaning. The firstborn of a mother, the firstborn of a father. Um, in my own family, I was the firstborn of my mother, and she hadn't had any children before me. And yet, it's a blended family, so I've got an older brother and sister. But I shall make him my firstborn isn't just about birth order, it's also about the preeminent position. That is, that he says, You are my father. He will cry to me, You are my father. That's speaking of this one who is David's greater son. And I shall also make him my firstborn, my preeminent. Think about what the scriptures say of Jesus, describing him as the firstborn of all creation, as well as the firstborn from the dead. Now, when I say that, was Jesus actually the firstborn ever was he the first person ever to rise from the dead? No, there were other cases of people that rose, but his is the important, his is the preeminent resurrection. And so I shall make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. And the point here is that he is the King of Kings. Was David the King of Kings? Well, only maybe in the sense that there were a lot of kings that weren't doing so well in his day. If you go before David's day and after David's day, there were some really big kings. In David's day in particular, not so much. But we have the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We have the greater son of David, who is reigning today and will reign throughout all of eternity. My loving kindness I will keep for him forever, and my covenant, there it is again, we've talked about this before, my covenant shall be, now we've already cut it, so we don't need to recut it. In fact, that would be hard to do. My covenant shall be confirmed to him. And so we have a confirmation of the covenant. It is cut with David, but then there is this idea. Its final fulfillment is in the greater son of David. In fact, I would merge this with the idea that's presented in Jeremiah chapter 31, where God promises a new covenant, not just something that's done on the outside, but a new covenant that takes place in men's hearts. Verse 29, so I will establish his descendants forever. By the way, the term his descendants, his seed, same term. Zerah is the Hebrew term. I will establish his descendants forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. So notice his descendants are established. That means that we get to be part of this. because we are co-heirs with Christ. We are joined with him in faith. And his throne, guess what? We get to be enthroned with him. His throne as the days of heaven. Verse 30, if his sons forsake my law, here are the conditional aspects of, not of the covenant in the sense that David's going to, lose the covenant and it'll be canceled, but in the sense of this situation, if his sons forsake my law, and let me just say, and they did, as Haman was recording this and passing it on, I don't know that that had happened yet. From our vantage point, it's already past tense. They did, starting with Solomon and David's other descendants. They did forsake the law. And do not walk in my judgments, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, and they did violate those things, starting with Solomon, who allowed pagan gods to be brought in. Remember, he marries wives from different countries around them, and not only did, and then after he dies, the kingdom is split, and that was part of God's judgment. Verse 32: if that happens, then I will punish their transgression with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. This is God spanking, and God did do that with the descendants of David up until the point where we have the Babylonian captivity, and David's children stopped being kings. Now the line is still there, and the promise is still there, and the promise is ultimately fulfilled in David's greater son, King Jesus. But this actually took place. But, and here's the limitation of that discipline, but I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. Remember how those elements of loving kindness and faithfulness were presented at the very beginning of the psalm. Verse 34, my covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. Once I have spoken by my holiness, I will not lie to David. God says, I'm going to bring the promise that I made to David, the covenant promise, I'm going to bring it about. So I'm not going to violate my covenant, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. I said I would do it. I'm going to do it. It's not going to happen quite the same way that you might have imagined. Yes, David's line is going to be removed from being kings, but I'm still going to keep it. I'm going to keep it by one who keeps the covenant, by one who does not go astray, by one who does not lead people in a wrong way, like Solomon did, like others did. Verse 35, once I have sworn by my holiness, and remember, when you swear by something, what you're saying is that thing by which I swore, may it be destroyed if I don't keep my promise. So once I have sworn by my holiness, may God's holiness, may what he is, be destroyed if he doesn't keep his promise. I will not lie to David. So notice all the nots. I won't violate, nor will I alter, nor will I lie to David. His descendants, his seed, shall endure forever. You say, well, where's David's seed today? and my answer is at the right hand of the Father. It's in the person of Jesus. And not only that, if we have been joined to Jesus by faith in him, then we have become co-heirs with him. Can I say it this way? We have become his seed. And we are connected to God's family. We've been adopted into the very family of God. His seed, his descendants shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. Notice the forever and the as I'm recording this right now, the sun is down. It's the middle of the night, but it's coming up in a little bit. It's coming up in the morning, and I can pretty much count on that. And notice, and his throne is the sun before me. It will be glorious. It will be certain. Verse 37: it shall be established forever, like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful. And so, yes, just like morning comes and the moon rises and the moon sets. We had a lunar eclipse last night, but all those things take place, and God is faithful as well. So we've already been working our way through. We saw Ethan singing in verses 1 and 2. We see God singing in verses 3 and 4. We saw Ethan singing again, verses 5 through 18. God singing, that's what we've been looking at in verses 19 through 37. One more section now, and it's going to end with Ethan singing. And this will be verses 38 through 52, where God has cast off his anointed one. You say, wait a second, it wasn't supposed to happen. We just had a promise that's not going to happen. And yet, that does happen, not permanently, but it does happen both with David's descendants. Remember, I said, eventually we're going to see David's descendants who were kings, and they will be kings, and the kingdom will be split, and then the kingdom will be taken away, and they won't be reigning anymore. You say, well, what's with that? And then when Jesus shows up, when the greater son of David does show up, he's going to be cut off as well. But the good news, it doesn't end there. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that there's a resurrection and an ascension, and he's in heaven right now. But notice the question: God has cast off his anointed one, and then, because this psalm is going to end mid-story, because when we're in the Old Testament, we're still mid-story, how long will God's wrath continue? That's going to be the closing question. Let's look at that, beginning in verse 38. But you have cast off and rejected. You have been full of wrath against your anointed. Remember the king, who's the anointed? That's the king. And I think you can look at this, and I think you can see Jesus here as well, because Jesus experienced the wrath of God. He experienced the cross. He experienced the curse. I think about Hebrews chapter 12 that talks about how he went to the cross enduring the shame. Verse 39, you have spurned the covenant of your servant. You have profaned his crown in the dust. You have broken down all his walls. You have brought his strongholds to ruin. That Ethan the Ezrahite, he looks at the promises of God to David. He looks at the Davidic covenant, and then he looks at what has happened in the ensuing history of Israel. And Lord, how does that work? You had a promise. We've been thanking you for that promise, and yet it all seems to have gone by the wayside. Explain that. Verse 41, all who pass along the way plunder him. He has become a reproach to his neighbors. You have exalted the right hand of his adversaries. You have made all his enemies rejoice. David's descendants seem like they're going downhill quick. Verse 43, you also turned back the edge of his sword and have not made him stand in battle. You have made his splendor to cease and cast his throne to the ground. You have shortened the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. And I already referenced Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 that talk about Jesus enduring the shame. And yet before we get to Jesus, we have that shame, and we have that turn back, and we have that all those problems that were experienced by David's descendants, but including all the way up to his greater descendant, Jesus. Verse 46, now the question, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? It's like God, it looked like, I'm not saying he did, but it looked like and it felt like God went on vacation. And even when Jesus was on the cross, remember what he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so the question is, will your wrath burn like fire? Remember what my span of life is, for what vanity you have created all the sons of men. I think the idea here is, Lord, if you're going to remember your promises, you better hurry up, because I don't live for all eternity. Now, this isn't denying life after death. It's just that had not clearly been revealed. But Lord, if you're going to do something, you better do it soon, because I'm not long for this earth. For what vanity you have created all the sons of men. What man can live and not see death? See how it's death. We're talking about not spiritual death, but physical death. What man can live and not see death? Can he deliver his soul from the power of Sheol? By the way, the answer is yes. but those things had not come to light. They had not been clearly revealed in the days of Ethan the Ezrahite. So those are unanswered questions. Verse 49, where are your former loving kindnesses, Lord, which you swore to David in your faithfulness? Again, the oath is reference. Lord, you promise. You didn't just promise. You give an oath. You didn't just give an oath. You cut a covenant. Where's the answer to all of that? Verse 50, and we're coming right to the end of the psalm. Remember, O Lord, the reproach of your servants, how I bear in my bosom the reproach of all the many peoples, with which your enemies have reproached, O Lord, with which they have reproached the footsteps of your anointed. Do you see a lot of reproaching here? And this reminds us that even the cross was a reproach. It was considered the most humiliating, and in an honor and shame culture, it was the most shameful sort of thing that could happen to somebody. And he bore our reproach. And so notice how the psalm ends, remember, Lord, all of these things. They were seeing not the cross, they were seeing the reproaches in their day, culminated, we know, by what Jesus did on the cross. But notice how the psalm ends. Verse 52, blessed be the Lord forever. There's still hope at the end of the story, and not only hope for this psalm, but we end with the double amen. Second part of verse 52, amen and amen. And that reminds us that this psalm is part of a whole collection of psalms. There are a number of different collections. Remember, we covered this way back when we first started going through the Psalms. The book of Psalms is structured into 5 books, and at the end of each book, and right now we're at the end of book 3, we're in chapter 89, Psalm 89. It ends with that double amen, letting us know that book 3 is over and a new chapter, a new section awaits us. These have been the Psalms mostly by Asaph. We've seen some by Ethan. We've seen some by another Ezraite, Haman. We've seen but it's all had that priestly element in this central section, book 3 of the Psalms. As we come to book 4, notice I put mostly unknown, but we're going to go back not to David, but all the way back to Moses. But we'll see that next time.